Hello, everybody. My report is on the electoral system and whether it's really still relevant today or not, and if it's something that we should, if not relevant, that we should do away with and look at something that could possibly be more efficient, such as the popular vote. Um, the United States has a long tradition of making sure minority votes are heard. Um, and I think this is probably the biggest reason as to why the United States has been so successful in the past and will be successful in the years to come. Um, Making sure that everybody's voice is heard can be obviously very complex, but it's also essential to our government to make sure that people aren't feeling suppressed, feeling like they're unheard, which can, of course, lead to negative feelings and lead to resentment of their government and their country. Um, since the conception of this country, really, it's been imperative that the minority has been heard. Not that it always has been heard, such as events as slavery and women's suffrage and even gay rights today. Um, but I think the building blocks are there and have been put in place for um, these systems to be able to, I guess, work themselves out, if you will. I've done a lot of research, and it seems like a lot of academia feels that, or at least I feel that a lot of academia feels that the popular vote is the way to go. And in fact, they suggested when our forefathers formed this union and formed the electoral vote, they felt most voters were uneducated and lacked the understanding of government and politics in the way things worked. And so, therefore, a lot of that was true, but I don't know if that was the biggest reason why the founding fathers decided to ultimately go with the electoral vote versus the popular vote. Because a lot of today's issues are issues that they had back then as well. The concepts aren't really new. The issues may be new, but the concepts overall are not. And in fact, I do think it still applies today that voters tend to be uneducated about the process. Great example. Not even though we do have the internet and we do have um, new and more convenient ways of communicating back and forth, it's just that people have a tendency, or some people just may not simply care about the inner workings of the government, what's going on. And you know what? That's fine, and that's their right. And in fact, in my daily life, I come across more people that know more about the daily life of what's happening with the Kardashians versus versus answering simple questions that have to do with our current issues in government and even our current leaders in government. So I don't think that there's too much discrepancy as to what was happening then as to what's happening now. But again, I just don't think that that was the major issue as to why they went with the electoral vote. One interesting fact is that Aristotle, even way back then, he was actually against. Um, he thought that people that weren't educated with electoral, or forgive me, that were uneducated about politics and government workings, that they had no business being in, or had no business in playing a role or voting at all. And in fact, he wrote that, quote unquote, what are the matters over which the general body of citizens should properly exercise sovereignty. It is dangerous for men of this sort of share in the highest offices, as injustice may lead to wrongdoing and thoughtfulness into error. So basically, what he was saying is that people that are uneducated about current events and what's going on, giving them a say in government actually can lead to catastrophes, if you will. Um, so there are many arguments as to why we're going with why we have currently the electoral vote and why we continue to use it today and not the popular vote. Um, I think what I'm going to focus on and what I focus on mostly on this report is probably the biggest. Um, and that's just simply superficially the popular vote appears to be the fairest way to elect our president. Um, and on the outside, it does seem to be. Um, everyone gets a fair vote. All the votes then is perceived to matter. And then, just like we were in high school electing a student body, the majority wins. Um, but before I get into that debate and that argument, I think it's really kind of important that we understand the electoral vote, or I guess the electoral process and what it consists of. The electoral consists of basically two houses, and it's considered the House of Representatives and the Senate. Each state gets two senates. Regardless of their population, they all receive two senators. All states get also representatives, but that's based on their population. So a state, let's say like California, will receive a lot more representatives per capita, based on their capital of people versus, let's say, Minnesota that doesn't have the volume of people, so hence Minnesota gets less representatives. And now these representatives, both senators and representatives, represent the people that actually elected them. And this is what makes up the college electoral. And the college electoral actually then ultimately are the ones that are voting for president. The people cast their vote for president, yes, and that's more of an indication or an idea of telling the state or the representatives how they should vote for the president. Most states do force whatever the popular vote is for those representatives and senators to place their vote as such, with the limit of two other states. I won't go too much into that, but just wanted to give a general summary of what the electoral vote is. Um, Actually, I believe that the electoral vote is nearly perfect the way it is. Um, Mostly because the founding fathers actually, I think the biggest reason why they went with the electoral vote is because they were really trying to entice the smaller states to join the Union or the United States, if you will. Um, what would be the rationale or the reason that Delaware, let's say, would want to join the Union? Being that they would have very small population and then they would have very little input as to the direction of the country and where it would go and placing policies. So ultimately, I think that's the biggest reason why they did it is because just simply not many states would have joined, especially the smaller ones. Um, and then thus, without the if we just went with the popular vote, the problem is that only the states with the biggest population would be the ones to elect the president. Um, and then thus the president then would spend most of his time or her time focusing on the issues of those bigger states because they know if they can capture those, let's say, 12 states that make up the 65%, that's an arbitrary number, but let's say it's 65% of the population, they would just spend time focused on those states and they would ignore other states' issues because they know that it's not as important to them. For instance, let's take in my report, I use New Mexico. Now, let's say New Mexico has a much higher population than the state of Maine. Well, Mexico may have completely different issues than the state of Maine. For instance, Mexico uh, would probably have issues or major concerns about, let's say, since it's a lot of its desert area, about water and water conservation, where Maine is a much wetter state. So the president could make policies based on or let's say cater to the issues that are affecting New Mexico most, and let's say we'll ignore issues such as timber issues and tree cutting issues in Maine because it's just not simply as important to him to get to the presidency. Um, and so therefore it's hard to say that one shoe fits all. In other words, what's good for Maine will also be good for New Mexico because A, the culture is different, and because of sheer geographical location. So then, of course, Maine is going to felt like they're simply not getting the representation that they deserve, and I certainly can't blame them. One of the biggest arguments, and I touched on it just a little bit ago, is the population or the popular vote. Um, the biggest uh, the biggest complaint, I guess, with the electoral vote right now is that people feel that their vote doesn't matter. They're disenfranchised because they're not actually casting their vote for the president. Thus, their vote isn't actually heard. They're just casting it for a representative or a senator. And so the populists that, or the proponents, forgive me, of the popular vote state that you would have less feelings of disenfranchised because of the simple fact that every vote counts. But I would argue actually the opposite. Um, you know, according to contemporary American society, um, there is actually a decrease by 30% during a non-election or presidential election year. So, in other words, 30% less people are voting because these people, obviously, with the president, they want their voice to be heard. Now, that doesn't really get to the point, but what really does is that if, let's say, those 12 states are actually the ones to ultimately elect their president, where is the incentive for a state like Delaware? Where are their voters? Where's their incentive to show up and vote since they know that California, Illinois, Texas, New York, Florida, and other states are ultimately the ones that are going to be able to elect their president. So I think you're going to actually have a lot more disenfranchised feelings if you went with a popular vote. Because I know I live in Minnesota and our population just simply is not anywhere as close to the population of those bigger states. So I would really feel that my vote is really irrelevant. Um, and I would also feel that that other states or the bigger states are also getting pandered to, or if not pandered, at least catered to their issues, and their issues are top priority and would be for the president. Um, and so therefore, I use that 30% less as only as an example that people, when there isn't a presidential election on the line, they just unfortunately just don't care as much. So if those states, kind of repeating myself here, that feel like there's nothing involved, of course they're not gonna vote either. So the 30%, I feel it would be a constant as far as moving forward, whether it's a presidential year or not, because I just think people would be more disenfranchised than they were. Um, Now, I think the framers of the Constitution really they really saw this, and they really needed to bring, they really wanted to make sure that these minorities were heard, and I think this was ultimately the fairest way to do it. Since the United States has really um, kind of adopted, I guess, the rule of utilitarianism, forgive me, which basically means that we create rules based on the most common good. In that rule, we kind of really decided long ago it's very important to have the minority vote represented. Um, and it's kind of our culture, and this is very apparent in our daily lives currently today, as I discussed earlier, and used examples of same-sex marriage, let's say, or uh, women's suffrage, which isn't necessarily current events, but I guess in the whole grand scheme of things, it kind of is, or slavery, or things like that. And so, why should it be really any different for representation of people in the smaller states? Because minority really is a minority when you're looking at voices and being heard. And so I think it's really hard. So I do agree with, yes, all the votes are equal when you're doing a populist vote, but not at risking. but not at risking or suppressing and giving people less influence in the smaller states. Um, and I just think that's what happens in the popular vote. So that's my report, and fairly nervous, so forgive me if I spitted and sputtered a little bit, and I hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you.